Okay, we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome. And I'm very, very happy to introduce you today, Adam Katz, who is, I want to describe you as being a linguist, Adam. I feel as though looking at your work, that seems to be where you fit mostly. And of course, Adam is the author of this lovely book, which I can't recommend to you enough, Anthropomorphics, an originary grammar of the center, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So, Adam, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. I want you to give your sort of elevator pitch of how you have developed upon the work of Eric Gans and the idea of the center for for human groupings, I suppose. I wanted to say civilization there. Maybe that's more appropriate. But please, by all means, give the elevator pitch of where your work fits into that and what makes it so groundbreaking as well.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I wouldn't call myself a linguist. I certainly don't have any linguistic training or degrees in linguistics or anything like that. So I wouldn't quite. I wouldn't want to describe myself. I might just call myself a generative anthropologist, which is good enough. I mean, I've got some other kind of qualifications, but that's all that really matters for this. But at any rate, to get to get to the real questions here. Yeah, well. I'm going to kind of do a little bit of groundwork because I'm not going to make any assumptions about what your audience knows about the originary hypothesis, which is, we talk about generative anthropology as sort of the field of knowledge, but I prefer the originary hypothesis as a more focused way of talking about what this is all about. And I want to get at what's especially groundbreaking about that, and then I could talk about what I've done with that in a way, in certain ways, reading against the grain of Eric Gans, who is the inventor, the creator of the originary hypothesis, which is a hypothesis of the origin of language, which means it's also a hypothesis of the origin of the human. And Gans followed up on the work of René Girard, who's it's quite likely a lot of your viewers are familiar with. He's a much better known thinker and academic who worked developed mimetic theory, which starts with, in a sense, you could say the intuitively obvious assumption that human beings are inherently mimetic beings. I mean, even Aristotle pointed that out, so that there's no novelty in that. And which means that they learn by imitating each other. In a sense, they're composed out of their reciprocal imitations of each other. And what Girard really pursued further, and he did this through a reading, first of all, of certain literary texts, especially 19th century and 20th century novels, but then pursued much further in kind of through anthropological evidence and I think through the Bible in particular, the assumption that that imitation leads to rivalry. Okay, you want what others have because you learned how to want it by imitating them, by following them, and kind of taking their desire as your own. So imitation, mimesis, inevitably gets to the point where the people involved are going to want the same thing, and it becomes a kind of zero-sum game. Right, only one of them can have it, and the more they want it because the other wants it, the more the value of that object is inflated, and this mimetic rivalry leads to a kind of mimetic crisis, and it's a mimetic crisis that puts the existence of the group. Right now, we're talking about kind of what I guess we call a proto-human group. It's not quite human yet, at stake. Because they can't, because the level of violence is so much that it becomes impossible for them to organize themselves in the way animals traditionally do, which is in accord with a pecking order, right? The problem with mimetic rivalry is it breaks down the animal pecking order, and because the alpha can kind of stand up against the beta, but the alpha can't stand up against everyone in the group, kind of rushing to the center itself, and so the pecking order breaks down. Now, Girard thinks that humans solve this problem by identifying a target against which to sort of discharge, in a sense, all this mimetic rivalry and resentment, right? And that's where he traces the origin of the scapegoating mechanism. Okay, and so he kind of sees the origin of the sacred in the scapegoat, and that's his reading of the anthropological record and religions prior to Judaism and Christianity in particular, so here's where Gans steps in and kind of makes the observation that if this original human group just sort of converged on one target and just killed that one person, there's no reason to think it would mean anything for them. Why would it be memorable? I mean, animals kill each other. Animals of the same species kill each other for all kinds of reasons, and it doesn't transform them in any way. It doesn't turn them into a new kind of species. They kill, another member of their species, and they go on about their business. So the question then becomes, what would make this meaningful? And Gans sort of concluded that there would have to be a sign, right? A sign that would make it meaningful. And his first way of thinking about it is that after they killed the originary victim, they would all point to it, and that pointing to the originary victim would be the way in which it became meaningful for them. But then he realized that once the pointing, the sign directed towards the object is the main thing, then you don't need the victim anymore, and you don't have to assume anyone's been killed. You can have the same sign put forward in response to the organization of the group around some kind of central object of desire, and in a sense, it becomes, I think, more realistic this way. You just have to assume that the group is surrounding, probably some food item. Gans very often likes to talk about in terms of a sort of a large animal that's just been killed, and this hungry group is about to proceed to eat it, and that's when you have the mimetic rivalry, and the group breaks down, and then one a member of the group issues what Gans calls the aborted gesture of appropriation. Okay, and the aborted gesture of appropriation is the first sign. In a sense, and again, it's very easy to imagine it, and I think that the scene takes on its kind of realness from the fact that all you have to imagine is everybody reaching for this central object, and then someone, in a sense, kind of hesitating and holding back, and instead of reaching for it, kind of stopping and pointing toward it, and then the other members of the group imitating that sign, and then you have the first, and then you have the first sign, and then that's the origin of language, and it's also the origin of the sacred, because what they're pointing to is the central object, and the central object is essentially God on the scene, and God is in a sense, that central object is in a sense telling them, commanding them to stand down, in a sense, and so you have a central object which is sacred, which is God, and you have the sign which is referring to that. And now, once you have that, then all of everything follows, right? And the way in which human beings organize themselves. Why is there ritual? Why do human beings have rituals? Right? And animals don't have rituals. What I mean, and rituals don't have any obvious utilitarian function, right? I mean, and there are all these complex rituals that we see in what used to be called primitive humans. I guess now we might say archaic or use another term. But what's the origin of ritual? Why is there even such a thing as God? Why do human beings believe in some kind of higher being? Why do they talk about it? Why do they make up stories about it, and so on? I mean, the idea that it's just kind of things they're afraid of, like thunder or something, is kind of silly, right? I mean, why would you even be afraid of these things? So that's Gans, and then Gans kind of he's written quite a few books where he kind of first of all works out how you would get fully developed language from this, and for me this is really the most important and the most astonishing of his books, which is The Origin of Language, which there's an edition, which he wrote in 1980, and you could probably still find that edition around, but there's a new edition that I wrote an introduction to, and he kind of rewrote it a bit and cut short some of the later chapters, which were dealing with you could say extraneous issues like questions of modernity and social structure. But the most important thing is he kind of shows how from that original ostensive sign, just pointing to something, we get our way to the imperative, then the interrogative, and then we get a declarative sentence out of it. And he shows us in a very, very rigorous way. And again, it's astonishing because he's doing something I don't think anyone else ever tried to do that, much less do it so successfully as he does it there. And then he has a series of books where he kind of follows this hypothesis of language origin through a whole range of cultural developments. He talks about, he goes through the ancient Greeks and he goes through, the ancient Hebrews in the Bible and so on. He deals with a lot of anthropological material, the emergence of the big man, and all kinds of stuff. And so it's a very rich discussion. And you could find, the end of culture is the second book, and then there's science versus faith, and then there's originary thinking, and then there's all right, it's got paradoxes in the title. It's slipping my mind right now, but anyway, those first 5 books really lays out a whole way of thinking about thinking about society, thinking about history, thinking about culture in terms of the originary hypothesis. So I'm of course relying upon all of this, and I enter in a certain sense. I go back and I kind of do some revisionary work on even his earlier books, even The Origin of Language, which is which seems to me pretty much complete and perfect. You could see in Anthropomorphics I kind of intervene in one place there and kind of raise a question about how we get from the interrogative to the declarative. But for the most part, I'm kind of resting on this, and I kind of reconfigure the scene a little bit. But the main thing that prompted that is to a certain extent, political questions and differences that I had with Gans, and his analysis of modern society is based on the assumption that what the Christian revelation did by essentially making individuals sacred is open up the possibility of a market order in which human beings engage in exchange and continually distance themselves from the kind of sacrificial practices that characterized human society up until that point. And it's a version of modernity that then leads into, in a sense, a kind of justification for liberal democracy. And in essence, it becomes a kind of liberalism. And when I first started working with GA, with the originary hypothesis, I had some differences with Gans, but I was still working within a very broad, liberal framework. So I was kind of pushing around at the edges and so on. But it got to the point where it seemed to me that, in a sense, this was kind of forcing you to ignore more reality than it was illuminating. And so I started to think, there's got to be, whatever you think you can actually do, whatever kind of society you think you can actually form, there has to be a way of thinking outside of the market order of liberal democracy and so on, right? I mean, even hypothetically, right? And we're talking about a discourse, a theory that's thoroughly hypothetical and should be encouraging you, to think outside of this. And there was kind of a certain refusal on Gans's part, it seemed to me, to do this. So I started to do it, but within originary thinking, right? For me, this wasn't a way of refuting, the originary hypothesis. It was a way of in fact being more faithful to it. And it seemed to me that what Gans kind of dropped at a certain point, or assumed had dropped out of human orders at a certain point, was exactly the center. And if you think about it on the originary scene, and then in all the subsequent ritual scenes that follow from it, the center is so compelling, so constitutive, so definitive, that you can't possibly imagine human beings doing anything outside of some reference to the center. Everything that organizes them is organizing them in relation to the center, and they're always thinking in terms of the center. And I think, to follow this through, in a sense, since Gans's inclinations were liberal, and in a way, kind of a fairly familiar sort of liberalism of someone who came of age in the U.S. in the 50s, in the post-war world, when U.S. liberal democracy seemed to be kind of setting the terms, kind of resolving all of these problems after this kind of spasm of totalitarianism that kind of had been defeated in the war, and there was a kind of triumphalism, right? That America has kind of solved these problems, and now liberal democracy, will solve these problems. So you solve problems in the voting booth and on the market, and so no one really controls anything, right? So to him, I think really focusing on the power of the center would have these kind of echoes of totalitarianism that he didn't want to, to carry along. He wanted to, he kind of developed this notion of an omnicentrism, which he doesn't really talk about that much, but it's in one of his books, in Originary Thinking. Near the end, he mentions what he calls an omnicentrism as in a sense, the only way of solving humanity's mimetic crisis, which again, on the face of it, sounds like a kind of really extreme, or at least one extreme version of a libertarian order, right? Totally, every where individuals kind of, I get, like Murray Rothbard would have one sort of version of this, where everybody's kind of a sovereign individual, and all your relations with everyone else are completely decided through freely chosen consent to this or that contract or so on. I mean, it seems to me that's the only way you could really make sense of an omnicentric order, and so it's at that point that I kind of turned very sharply back to the center, and in part because, again, this seems to me not to correspond to reality, because the more decentered things get on one hand, and here I was influenced by neo-reaction, and in particular the work of Chris Bond, who was working with Bertrand de Juvenel's theory of power, and this idea, which everyone was talking about around whatever 2016, 2017. I don't know if they're talking about it so much anymore, but I don't think anything's really changed in this regard, that the more decentered things seem to be on one level, the more centralized they're getting on another level, right? That it's the centralization of the state that creates individuals that are ever more kind of isolated and supposedly free as individuals. And so the only way to account for that is to go back and say, okay, the center is what makes the originary scene possible, and it has to be what makes every single scene that follows from it possible as well. And so this is a different way of reading history. Instead of reading history as a process of decentering and growing autonomy of the margins, then you read history basically as kind of these different forms that the center can take. And then that opens up a lot of discussion. I mean, it's not, the center doesn't have to be totalitarian in the way that term tends to be used, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that there's got to be a Stasi agent, be next door to you reporting on everything that you're doing. That you could have an extremely centered society that where the center works more through tacit shared norms that are inculcated in various ways, that work through levels of subordination and different levels of responsibility and authority and so on. So there's a lot of things to talk about here, and it seemed to me that not only would provide for much more accurate descriptions of the society that we're actually living in, than trying to figure out. Again, he's in a sense he's still. In a sense, his faith has become frayed, I would say, in liberal democracy, but he still thinks in terms of how we could save liberal democracy from all these things that are somehow threatening it. Well, why were all these things threatening it, right? If it was so good, if it settled all these questions, then why do we need to be so defensive about it? Why isn't it just conquering new territories and solving all its problems? And why is there so much contention? And why is there so much resentment? And so on. So he's still thinking in terms of all this stuff somehow coming from like outside of liberal democracy. It doesn't really touch on its essence, where, you know, at a certain point you have to say this is liberal democracy, and if this is liberal democracy, then you know, well, first of all, we should stop calling it liberal democracy, because I mean that's the name it gives itself. So you're sort of buying into, you know, you're buying into the propaganda of the regime to call it, you know, what it would refer to itself, or at least what a lot of social scientists would refer to it as. I mean, that became, I mean, liberal democracy, you know, became a term. It's one of these things that you know, if you check, you know, the Google Ngram, you know, viewer, for when words start to get used again, which you know is you know, is very interesting. It gives you kind of a mini history of things in itself. Liberal democracy didn't really exist as a phrase before World War II. It's completely an invention of, again, massive you know, ideological propaganda apparatuses following World War II to name it this thing is a way of distinguishing it from, you know, too much democracy on one side, too much, you know, anarchy on another side, definitely not Nazism, definitely not communism, and so on. So it's really just a way of kind of marking the difference between this legitimate form of society and all these different forms of illegitimacy. So in a sense, it can't explain anything. So set all of that aside, and if you start looking at, well, what's the relationship? You know, how you know, what's the center like, and how does centralization take place, and how is everybody organized in relation to the center? Then not only can you get a much more accurate description of what's going on, and things don't kind of shock you and mystify. Oh my God, they did this, now they did that. Things start to make sense. You can see why those battling over the center, trying to control the center unsuccessfully. Because in a sense, that's part of the problem, that there's a struggle over the center, but in a sense, it's a struggle over the center that nobody can avow, because you're not supposed to struggle over the center. No one's supposed to control the center. So in a sense, you get this paradoxical result where there's even more struggling over the center, and anyone who gets control of the center wants to kind of clamp down on anything that could challenge that, precisely because there's no real kind of authoritative possession of the center. So in a way, that's why you see so many of these, you know, increasingly bizarre things that you know that we're all noticing and asking where they're coming from. So not only does it help you to explain this much better, I think, but it also helps you to think about, well, okay, what do we do, right? Which is, in a sense, you know, the most important question, right? There's no point to saying how bad things are if you don't have some way of thinking about how eventually they could get better, even if none of us individually can really do all that much about it. But well, what can we do? What can anyone do? What could be done collectively? Who can do what? I mean, these are the questions that you would have to start to answer. And I think, you know, if we think about what's involved in a centered order, then we can at least start to take on those questions. And hopefully, you know, right now it's just it's just really, in a sense, it's me and a few other people who are really interested in that. If there were dozens of us, ultimately hundreds of us interested in this, we'd be having very lively, very robust conversations about what's going on and what should be going on, and so on. So in a sense, this was the political context, but then, you know, the originary hypothesis, it's sort of it's a very integrated way of thinking, and it's not like, you know, again, it's not really an ideology in the sense that you can't just say, I'm going to use it for this. You have to, you know, you have to think through all the way. And this did lead me to go back and critique a lot of other, a few other concepts that you know, that was central to the way Gans had been working with the originary hypothesis, a certain liberalism. In a way, I've been doing kind of, you know, among other things, a sort of deconstructive work of identifying and making explicit these places where there's kind of already implicit liberalism, even his descriptions of the scene itself, and certainly his descriptions of early societies and so on, right? So in other words, he's a consistent thinker, right? And so there's a kind of telos, there's a kind of liberal telos that he built into it. And so I've been going back and trying to kind of extract that liberal telos, and in place of it put you know, trajectories of the center. that don't really have a telos to it, but in a sense that you could say that they imply certain projects, because what if you know, if you want to think about it morally, politically, ethically, well, if you're thinking in terms of the center, then, you know, to put it simply, you want the center to be the center, right? And you want the center, if everything's organized in relation to the center, you want that to be done explicitly and coherently. And so, I mean, a lot of anthropomorphics is kind of an attempt to trace that out. And you know, what I've been focusing on since anthropomorphics is really trying to think this through in terms of technology, right? Which is kind of there. I talk a little bit about it in anthropomorphics, but I've been getting much more into it and trying to think in terms of information, in terms of data, in terms of an algorithmic order, and so on, and what all this implies for for thinking in terms of the center. You have any questions? That was a kind of a long introduction on my part, a long answer to your first question. So
no, that was great. I think that was a really good introduction. And you know, I'm so glad that I'm talking to you now. So much of what you said has resonated with me. Not just mentioning Chris Bond, who I interviewed recently, very interesting chap. His work is well worth checking out. But also my own writing, in my book, The Uniqueness of Western Law, I was emerging from libertarianism, and, you know, libertarian thinkers I was surrounded with, you know, including a lot of Rothbardians. And my contention with libertarianism was pretty much exactly everything that you're talking about, Adam, which is, well, I was very influenced by Frank Van Dun and the idea that groups need to have a shared definition of justice. Each of us is necessarily enculturated into a particular culture. And so, you know, we're going to have some shared language. We're going to have all kinds of shared metaphors, and, you know, the list goes on. Now, a shared definition of justice, which would, I mean, inevitably, it's going to have to come down to some shared fundamental beliefs, objective beliefs, probably some Platonistic ideals even. And, you know, so that was my main contention there, you know, and then I became influenced by radical orthodox thinkers. I don't know if you're familiar with that school of thought, but those are thinkers like John Milbank.
Milbank, yeah.
Yeah, well, another one of those thinkers is Catherine Pickstock, and in her work, she's saying things again very similar to what you're saying, Adam. She's saying, you know, in a civilization where we are, you know, taking various concepts, various ideas for granted as being shared, really the givenness, the giftedness to our language and everything, for a civilization, it has to boil down to some kind of shared liturgy. You know, there's got to be some kind of shared ritual, not just a mythos. There's got to be something that's even collectively shared as an activity. So I was, you know, influenced by that thinking as well. So then to stumble across these ideas, Adam, you can imagine how much it, you know, resonates with me. You know, the idea that you know, a center is required, not just as a point of reference, but also from which we do have a shared telos. We've got an end there to which we can all work towards, and there's so much that comes with that in terms of one's group mindedness and public spiritedness, because of course then, you know, being involved in activities around the center, this gives one a sense of trust in one's fellows in the group. This gives one a sense of assurance in the loyalty of others. And, you know, I would contend that, you know, the idea that Christianity is the force that has led to a kind of spiritually individualistic breakdown of this kind of thinking, this more sort of, what can you call it, corporate thinking, I suppose. Because, of course, I mean, Christianity is itself very corporatist, very explicitly so, the idea of the body of Christ. And, the partaking of the Eucharist, of course, we're consuming Christ, but we're also consumed into Christ as well. Now, okay, I would say that with certainly nominalism in the Middle Ages and just all kinds of individualistic trends in the West, as well as I think Europeans are just naturally more individualistically inclined for whatever reason, maybe some biological reasons. We don't need to go into that. But, I do think that has caused a decline, as well as I think, I think the West is a victim of its own success. And, as civilizations, become very prosperous, the competition starts to turn inward, and people do tend to become more individualistic. The competition starts to become more commercial. The economy becomes much more financialized, speculative, I guess, and this leads to a breakdown, that individualism, which is a very spiritual individualism. It's kind of Promethean rebelling against Zeus. The attitude is very kind of hyper novelty, innovative. It's kind of like a teenage rebellious spirit in a way, as well as being a little bit psychopathic, I suppose. This wanting to break away from the center, from the group. Perhaps even there's something Gnostic about it as well. You want to break away from the natural order. It's a reduction down to the ego, and wanting to be free in that sense. I think as society becomes more prosperous, I think there's going to be this trend towards individualism, but especially a spiritual individualism as well. And who can deny it? You look around us. I think the predictions of John Gray, I don't know if you've read any of him, that we're going to see things become increasingly Gnostic in the West. People's attitudes are going to become increasingly individualistic, egoistic even. And you were asking, well, what can stop that? What can stop that? I agree with you. I think there needs to be some kind of center, not just as a helpful point of reference, but I think a very religious, I think, return to the center of our civilization as being something where sacrifice is made, very much like in the originary scene that Gans was talking about. It has to be something where we understand how important it is to take responsibility and to be making the sacrifices ourselves. So, I mean, it would have to be something that's really compelling. It's really going to capture the imaginations of people. I don't see what that could be in the context of the West other than traditional Christianity. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, whether you think I'm correct there.
Well, I mean, I'm broadly very sympathetic with with the account that you're given and the problems that you're posing here. And I read Pickstock many years ago, actually, before. Well, maybe not before I knew GA, but certainly before I got interested in these kinds of questions in particular. And yes, it's a powerful way of thinking. And let me first point to what I see as the problem with sacrifice. and it might be quibbling over the word, and the word might mean different things, but here, one argument of Girard's that I find extremely compelling, and Gans, I think, kind of takes this over without a lot of modification. Well, Gans calls it the Christian revelation. I'm not sure if that's how Girard talks about it. And central to that is the way in which Jesus, in a sense, sets himself up, is set up as, I mean, I'm not sure the best way of talking about that, as a scapegoat, but in a sense, as a scapegoat to end all scapegoats, and to kind of discredit all scapegoating. And the thinking is kind of like this: Jesus is, in a sense, completely innocent, and precisely because he's completely innocent, he draws the wrath of everyone else upon him, and that you should, that you should not, that you should not scapegoat is in a sense his fundamental claim, and it's for that very thing that he gets scapegoated, and so the sacrifice of Jesus, in a sense, discredits the whole scapegoating mechanism, and it can't be carried out in good faith anymore. I mean, it goes on for a while. Scapegoating continues. It's still scapegoating today. We see scapegoating, whatever, on Twitter, on social media, and so on. But in a certain sense, again, this is Girard's argument, and I think ultimately it's right. Yeah, well, we still do that. We still fall into this. We're still mimetic beings, and for Girard, that's why we still need Jesus. We still need Christianity, and so on. But we can't really believe it anymore, right? I mean, it could be that at one point a community could believe that this particular individual who was cursed with, having sores or being deformed in some way, was really a sign that the community can only purify itself by destroying, killing this individual, right? I mean, that was credible for a long time throughout human history, right? Human sacrifice was obviously credible for a long time throughout human history. So the idea that certain beings can be offered up to the deity or to the god emperor, the emperor, who's deified or whatever, that was credible, and we could see why that's credible, because we're capable of focusing and concentrating all of our mimetic rivalries and resentment on a single individual, and in a sense believing that we can remove that resentment by sacrificing that individual. And it probably works for a while, right? Everybody calms down after something like that. And if you do it regularly, then it might become a way of sort of lowering the temperature, in a sense. But again, the point of Jesus' sacrifice is that you can't really believe that anymore, right? We might still try to invent scapegoats, but we can't really believe that anymore. And this introduces very significant problems, because if this was the way humans organize themselves, again, one disagreement between Gans and Girard is that Gans thinks that scapegoating comes into place once there's a human being at the center, right? So he sees that as kind of following not just the emergence of the big man, who kind of becomes a center of ritual and distribution in certain archaic societies, but even empires, and I think the sacral kingship is really, that's the way I would kind of focus it. Sacral kingship as the origin of scapegoating, because the king, the sacred king, is sort of the conduit. It's where the divine meets the human. It's the mediation of them, and so the sacred king is responsible for um, for conferring the benefits of the gods upon humans. And so if things go wrong, it must be because the Sacred King's not doing that anymore. And so you just have to kill the Sacred King and put another one in place until, that person, for whatever reason, kind of, it might be anything. They didn't follow some ritual the right way. I mean, you can always make up something, right? And we always make up things, right? We always make up things we want to blame someone for something, right? And there's a kind of radical Girardian, position, which would get to the point that any time we commit any kind of, take any kind of punitive action against someone else, there's a kind of little bit of scapegoating in there. And I think there's some truth to that, that even some serial killer who, laughs in the faces of his victims and deserves the death penalty, and there's no question about his guilt or anything like that. Even there, I think a radical Girardian would say there's still a little bit of scapegoating. Maybe we have to, we have to put this person to death. It's kind of our obligation. We have to protect, others from this person, and we have to have some sense that there's a consequence for what you do, and all this is necessary. But even so, we should be, in a sense, we should always have a little bit of I don't know, residence or hesitation in doing this, even if we do it. And that's why there are kind of these rituals around the death penalty, right? There, that's why you have these silly things where, if someone who's going to be executed in 2 days kind of gets sick, they'll delay the execution, so he can get better so that they can execute him, right? All of these little rituals are because this has to be formalized in a way so that we can be sure we're not just acting out of a kind of uncontrolled passion. Right, but this is kind of regulated, it's controlled, it's confined, and it's constrained, and all of this is necessary. And so, the need to be very careful about what kind of violence gets sanctioned, because there's this implicit scapegoating in all of it, I think is the cause of a lot of the things that you're talking about. I mean, the increase, for example, one kind of individualism, which we could call a kind of libertinism, is because we're more and more hesitant about enforcing any kind of norms on individual behavior. And obviously we could trace that through, from the beginning of liberalism until now. Well, and why is that? Because, and if you look at kind of the arguments that are always made in terms of conferring, civil rights, giving liberties to this group or that group, it always follows, the same path, that, the things that they do that we object to, that really just says more about our own inability to, accept some kind of difference. It's all about, maintaining conformity amongst ourselves. We don't really have an objection to that, or it's kind of, it's false in some way, the objection that we have to that. And so the answer always becomes, well, to not object to it at all. Right. And so, again, I don't associate this with Christianity, but you could definitely have a Christianity that does not kind of slide into this, or at least I think you can. We don't know all the possibilities. It's certainly, worth trying. But again, you could see that there's a kind of family resemblance, in a sense, between the way in which Christianity valorized suffering, right, and valorized victimage, and made that, I mean, the God of the Christian God kind of sacrificed himself for humanity, underwent a trial and was tortured and so on, right? So then that in a sense becomes a sort of sacralized figure in general. And if you look at if you look at the modern left, I think that you'll see that it operates on a kind of martyrological principle. It's one kind of martyr after another who is kind of essentially put in the place of Jesus, and in a sense that's why it works, right? Because it takes this kind of familiar scapegoating structure. And so I'm going through all of this in part in order to make the point that, again, I'm not disagreeing with anything that you're saying, but these are the difficulties. These things would have to be thought through. These things would have to be understood. They'd have to be made more explicit, and we would have to realize, because again, I don't think we're going to go back to, and I think that it would be a disaster to go back to something that would be the equivalent of human sacrifice, right? I mean, it's possible, and and I guess anything is possible in a sense, but say most people, I think, even people who are anti-liberal, who want to kind of overthrow the order, who are in favor of much stronger authority and so on. I don't think anyone today, would want to throw weak-looking infants off of a cliff, right? Like the Spartans did, or other kinds of ways of kind of targeting the weak, or the seemingly disposable, and so on. So this sense that we kind of restrain and refrain our tendency to exclude, to demonize, the scapegoat, that seems to me to be permanently with us. So it's a question of how then to incorporate that in such a way so that it's possible to privilege the kinds of things that do need to be privileged, which are some of the kinds of things that you were talking about, right? That does seem to be there does need to be some kind of shared practices, shared norms. There has to be valorization of things like courage. There has to be a valorization of an ability to sacrifice yourself in the sense of setting aside utilitarian desires, what you feel like doing, what you want to do for something higher. You have to be, and I think a lot of it is I would think about it in terms of mimesis and imitation, which is to say, we have to valorize emulation. I mean, that's maybe one thing that's been lost. We all do. We all, I mean, the kind of the sort of popular version of it now is role models, and that could be used in kind of silly ways. But the basic idea is right. Of course, we learn by watching others. So in a sense, everything comes down to the others that we're watching, and how models are produced and presented, and it has to be possible to have people who are superior in various ways, objectively superior in various ways, whether it's strength, whether it's courage, whether it's intelligence, whether it's perseverance, whatever it might be. It has to be possible to valorize those people as models without instantly giving in to the temptation to tear them down, because it seems that by building them up as models, we must be denigrating someone else who by implication is worthless and can be discarded, or can be ridiculed or whatever. So that, I think, from a civilizational perspective, that's sort of the task that's required, right? To have strong models that can be protected as models, right? And without being torn down, and without being, without that seeming to be kind of just an implicit way of attacking someone else, and without, and again, accepting the fact that the models will be kind of in some way or another aesthetically or normatively centered, right? And that might imply that certain ways of being are better than other ways of being, of course. And so we have to be able to do that without, at the same time, saying, someone with, a 90 IQ, who cares about that person? Because there's, we're at a point where, I mean, everyone can do useful, productive things. Everyone can have, everyone can have a good life, right? And a good life in the sense of a meaningful life where they're involved in sort of activities that challenge them and that they can master, and activities where they're involved in collaborative, enterprises with others, where they're teaching others and learning from others, and part of a kind of chain of transmission of cultural, capacities and cultural values and so on. I mean, that's possible for everyone. So in a sense, that's one side of what you were getting at. Now, the other side, the more specific, the liturgical part of it is in a sense even more interesting to me, because that kind of that opens up questions that I see as very much within GA, and in a sense they're language questions, because I've also gotten to the point I didn't quite get to this in anthropomorphics. I wasn't I might have had the idea at some point, but I hadn't really kind of set upon it. But I've been kind of writing a bit more about it lately. That in a certain sense, prayer is really the sort of prototypical linguistic act. And I see it that way because it's it kind of unites those four speech acts that are kind of fundamental to the emergence of language: the ostensive, the imperative, the interrogative, and the declarative. And if you kind of look at prayers, and especially really good prayers, and we have a lot of those, right? I mean, I think probably every religious tradition has some very kind of beautiful prayers, because this is what was the most important thing to these cultures for quite a long time, and so they put a lot of intellectual effort into it. I think the quintessential prayer is to essentially to confess your inadequacy in kind of meeting the demands of the central being of God, and to ask God to give you the strength to do what God is commanding you to do, right? So there's a kind of questioning, there's a kind of commanding, there's a request, there's a central object that you're pointing to, and there's also declarative. It's kind of it's statements, right? You're making statements. I've fallen, I've fallen, I've sinned, and so on. I haven't done what you asked. I've done this. There's kind of a confessional element to it, and here's what I want to be able to do. This is what you want me to be able to do. These are your commands. This is how I'm trying to meet them. And so, in a sense, it's a completely integrated, linguistic act, the prayer that includes all of them, as opposed to the philosophical tradition, which I've kind of become more, I don't know, critical of, hostile to. Again, this Gans had this very interesting definition of metaphysics, which he more or less kind of identified with philosophy. He was kind of advancing a critique of metaphysics that was kind of in the tradition of philosophy, right? Heidegger and others, who, when they were critiquing metaphysics, they're mostly critiquing what Heidegger would have called Platonism and Aristotle and so on. And for Gans, that was he defined that as the assumption that the declarative sentence was the original linguistic act, right? And so if the declarative sentence is the original linguistic act, then the fundamental question is true or false, right? Because sentences are set up in such a way that they can either be true or false, right? The simplest, any declarative sentence could be true or false. You can always, and this is why there's logic and all these other things that follow from philosophy, right? If I say, whatever the sky is blue, that's either true or false, right? And we can determine it one way or another. I mean, help me God isn't true or false, right? If we're starting with ostensives, beginning with, and in a certain sense, there's that in the philosophical tradition as well, right? Wonder, right? All inquiry begins with wonder, right? So there's a recognition. Wonder is more of an ostensive, right? Something just kind of comes upon you, and kind of absorbs you, overthrows whatever kind of assumptions you brought to it, right? But imperatives also are pre-declarative, and a lot of our transactions, both with God but also with each other, are in the form of imperatives. And one thing that I still want to do, that I kind of point to in anthropomorphics, but really want to develop somehow, that I'm still not quite sure about, is to get at this whole world of this whole imperative world, this whole really ostensive imperative world that underlies all of our engagements with each other, all of our activity. We're always, we're always kind of giving orders to each other, making requests of each other, and imperatives go the whole gamut, from the command issued by kind of a supreme leader on the one hand, to the humble request of sort of the lowliest, servant on the other hand, right? A request is also, is also an imperative. Help me, give me something. Take note of me, look at me, right? All of these things, these are also imperatives, right? So linguistically, imperatives kind of, the only thing that an imperative doesn't allow for is an illusion of complete equality, right? Because there's always an asymmetry to any imperative, right? If you're making a request, you're implicitly, recognizing a superior who can grant your request. And if you're giving a command, you're issuing a command, and you're implicitly assuming that there's an inferior who's going to observe your command. And so in a sense, it's the declarative sentence that creates a kind of illusion of egalitarianism, right? Because anyone can say a declarative sentence, and anyone can say whether it's true or false, and can and in a sense that's why, in a certain sense, philosophy ultimately leads to a kind of rationalism, and a kind of rationalism which posits a reason that we could find in each individual human being, and there's a kind of egalitarianism that follows from that, and a kind of political theory of consent and so on that follows from that. We couldn't have a political theory or a political system based on consent if we weren't assuming everyone's rational beings. And what does it mean to be a rational being? That you can kind of judge the truth or falsity of a declarative sentence, basically. And insofar as everyone's capable of doing that, then everyone could decide whether they want to kind of sign a contract or not. They can be responsible for doing what the contract commits them to, right? So there's a dimension of that. I mean, I'm not against various forms of consent and various forms of contracts and property. I mean, all of that's essential, but underneath it all, and what up until now, again, because of the dominance of philosophy or metaphysics, we don't really have an account of what I think is the much more enduring and much more important ostensive imperative order that makes any kind of interaction possible before we even talk about consent. We must already be in some relation to each other before we're talking about consenting to something, right? Again, we have to be speaking the same language at any rate, right? And that already implies, that we're bound up in all kinds of ways, and that we're kind of responsive to demands and cues, and even things like body language, right? That works through on an ostensive and imperative level as well, right? Someone gives you a certain look, and they're kind of telling you, all right, you've gone a bit too far with that, right? Or they give you another kind of look, and that means keep going, tell me more, something like that. So everything we can get very kind of nuanced and granular in looking at the way ostensive and imperatives work at every level. And I think for me, the way I sum that up is in terms of pedagogy and in terms of learning, which it seems to me philosophy for the most part is kind of overlooked, because again, if you assume people are rational, then they're just kind of born that way, and you could just start talking about what's true and false. And it seems to me, the most interesting thing about human beings is that we teach each other, and that we learn from each other, and that goes on, all throughout our lives. We're always teaching, we're always learning, and the networks that we set up in order to teach and learn from each other is in a sense what culture is, and so you can almost say that a good society is one where all the pedagogical orders are intact, and you could see that in some very kind of down to earth ways, right? I mean, just think about the way we've totally discarded apprenticeship relations, right? Which was once the way pretty much everyone came into adulthood, right? You were apprenticed to to a particular, sometimes maybe in the family if you're if we're talking about agriculture, but there's always some kind of apprenticeship that everyone's expected to go through, and of course there are various forms of initiation that people are expected to go through, and all of that has been discarded, and you could see it that that's the kind of stuff that sometimes gets attacked the most, partly because a lot of that stuff is bound up in specific ethnic groups, and it's bound up in families, and it's bound up in specific communities. And so there's always an exclusiveness to it, because it always involves learning specific byways, right? Specific habits and specific forms of mutual recognition. And so all of that has to get broken up. And why that gets broken up? Well, again, that's when we're talking about how, the emergence of the modern state and the modern state, which is based on egalitarianism and the creation of equal citizenship, and then everything that gets in the way of that then becomes essentially an enemy of the state. And all of these forms of initiation and apprenticeship, which is to say all of these pedagogical relationships, again, unless the state can dictate their terms, from beginning to end, absolutely, and regulate them, then they become unacceptable. And when the state wants to dictate their terms, completely from start to finish, that really is just a way of empowering others to kind of find things wrong with them and attack them and accuse them and so on, and so they can't be sustained anymore. And I think a lot of the things that people see as having gone wrong, really are a result of we don't have networks, we don't have structures that bring people from the time that they're born to the time that they're adults in a way that they're guided and they're kind of directed and they're taught and so on at each step along the way in a way that gives meaning to each step along the way, right? So whatever is going to be done to kind of fix this, I think that it would have to have that component, and that will always be necessary. It will always be necessary, however technologically advanced we get. However, even if everything is run by algorithms and so on, we're still going to be training the algorithms, which means we're still going to be training each other how to engage with algorithms, what makes one algorithm better than another, how to shape them, and whatever. And so you will always need that, because there will always be imperatives and ostensives that that we need to work with each other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything you just said there. And talking about all my complaints about liberalism and libertarianism before, I mean, it was precisely that. There was this sense of modernity is trying to reduce everything to contracts. It's very contractarian. And I thought, hold on a second, we're speaking the same language here. We're sharing all kinds of metaphors and everything. What are these organic ties that we already have? Can we focus on those? Can we look at where that's come from? Can we look at seeing how that can be strengthened? What gives rise to that? And is there a way that we can, I don't know, construct society around that kind of thing? And it's I say organic. There's something also very familial about it. It's very natural, the natural ties that are there. And when I imagine the originary scene, and I imagine this, first king, first priest character holding off. No, I'm not just going to dive in as some alpha male and eat, and you can have whatever's left. There's a sort of holding off there. I imagine this figure to be like a father figure. I mean, it may be a father. This is maybe the head of a tribe, perhaps. And I mean, this is why you see in the most primitive human groups, not just animism, but actually, the evidence now is that more widespread was, the belief in the sort of one God as a kind of all father, the kind of sky father. There was a paternal figure there, bringing order into the world, and the religion of our time, modernity has so reduced our language down to the declarative. We can't give orders to each other. You do your own thing. We're also atomized now. That we were talking about technology before. I'm trying to lead on to that. Why I think we're so obsessed with the innovative and technology now. I think it's because the religion of our time is this Gnosticism. It is this egoistic spiritual individualism, whereby okay, we're all doing our own thing, and we have the state who, the only public creed for it is that there are no public creeds. It's just making sure the contracts are all adhered to between us. It's just acting as a middleman to all our relationships. And so, all the organic relationships are slowly dissolving. The family, arguably, what can I say? The traditional organic family structures, they are, being eroded, from every possible attack vector in the West, it seems. And so, what is left? What is the hope of the isolated individual? I mean, today it seems to be transhumanism, which is a very Gnostic idea. And I don't just mean sort of trans in the sense that is isolated egos believe. If I say that I am a woman, that means that I am a woman, and it doesn't matter who it is, J.K. Rowling or whoever it's going to be. If they come along and say, "Well, hold on a minute, there are some biological realities here. You might not actually biologically be a woman," that has to be absolutely rejected. That is evil, according to this, this new belief, this new Gnostic religion. And so, I'm kind of just hoping that as people realize that removing the center from civilization, so not having an end to our civilization anymore, all we have is just the means. We just have tools, we just have techne. That is all that we have, and we got to just kind of find in this liberal conception of man, just find our own end, our own purpose, invent our own from one day to the next, even. So it seems to me that there's this kind of Gnostic hope that eventually technology will just advance so much it will free our will, our ego, from the shackles of this body and the natural order around us. It's a double-edged sword. There's a kind of rejection of the natural order. I'm a woman. Don't give me biological facts. Don't give me natural order. Don't give me any of that. You're limiting me. You're, in a sense, doing some kind of violence to my will. But technology will just eventually, I'll download my brain into a computer, or whatever it is people think is going to happen, and I'm kind of hoping that the puritanical purity spiraling of wokeism is eventually going to come to the conclusion that what you've just said, Adam, you can't really do without the center. You can't really do without embodiment. Our whole understanding of everything comes from the fact that we are embodied, and we have personhood because we have grown. We've been enculturated against our will, but nevertheless, that's what we are. That's what's happened to us. I can only hope that at some point there will be a massive reeling back as people realize it's not possible, and there is some kind of reversion back to the, what can I say, like the paternal figure who was at least instrumental in the center at the originary scene.
I actually have I have more hope for technology maybe than you do, and I'll say why. I think that the one thing that I've noticed, and the more I read, I read now a lot of there's tons of academic writing about technology and computers, and by very intelligent and knowledgeable people, and a lot of it is very interesting. But it's interesting, the thing that since they're all they're academics, so they're at some point to the left, right, and they have to display their anti-racist and homophobic and anti-sexist and anti-transphobic bona fides and so on, right? So they always get to the point where they start complaining about algorithms and the algorithmic order, because a lot of people notice this online as well, and a lot of kind of dissident right people notice this online, and it becomes the source of some some amusing memes, right? That that the algorithms seem to be all of these things that that we supposedly shouldn't be anymore. They tend to be a bit racist, and they tend to be a bit sexist, and they seem to believe that there are differences between groups, and they seem to believe that that there are differences between the sexes, and so on. And there are reasons for this, which is that one thing that that algorithms, and again, in a sense, we can reduce things to to algorithms to a certain extent at this point, because that's basically how things are automated now, and that's what what artificial intelligence, whatever that's going to be, is going to look like. I mean, not only are algorithms a lot more interesting and fallible and diverse than people tend to think, but they're the embodiment of probabilistic forms of thinking, and they're the embodiment of hypothetical forms of thinking. And it seems to me that those forms of thinking are not really friendly to these decentralizing, centralizing by decentralizing is kind of the best way I've had of describing them, right? That you keep finding some new corner of oppression where you have to confer new rights, but in order to do that, you have to add more power to the state and more reach to the state, and more and more intrusiveness and violence and so on to the state. It seems to me that the more the algorithms are kind of given some breathing room, in a sense, the more difficult that's going to be, because the algorithms, the algorithms are connected with they're kind of a reading of reality that's sort of unsentimental, and this kind of unsentimental reading of reality. It doesn't mean that we give it a say on everything, right? I mean, yeah, the algorithm might decide that this particular ritual is irrational, and so on as well. But that won't necessarily be the case either. We don't even know that for sure. It's quite likely that algorithms can recognize the rationality of rituals if they're programmed right, and if the right kind of thinking goes into the programming. And I think, in fact, it probably be a lot easier and a lot more likely to have algorithms that recognize the value and importance of rituals than to have algorithms that refuse to recognize the difference between men and women. And I think it's not really such a bad way to lay our bets in the future. Again, which doesn't mean it's going to happen by itself, because algorithms are always, they're human products, they're artifacts, right? But it does mean that I think it's a very useful exercise to take all of those things that you were saying that you wanted, whether it would be a kind of renewal of Christianity, whether it's a renewal of a kind of paternal authority figure, to take these kinds of these interests, these desires, and try and translate them technologically. And what would it look like? How would you kind of write up? Again, I'm not necessarily saying do this realistically, but I mean, actually, although maybe at some point, but what would an algorithmic order that made a place for that look like? I mean, algorithms don't exclude any of that, right? They don't exclude authority. They don't exclude chains of command. They don't exclude people trusting each other. They don't exclude people teaching each other. And I think that it's better to think in terms of technology as less as kind of something that's extraneous to the human, and more as something that's kind of analogous to something like architecture, right? Something that we're shaping, that's going to house us in one way or another, and we could shape. So it's like like a cathedral, right? What goes into, think of all the thought that went into constructing some of these these European cathedrals in through the Middle Ages, right, and beyond. I mean, they're obviously astonishing, they're intricate, and you have to assume that there are kind of traditions, and I mean, I'm sure people know this much more than I do. Obviously, I'm not a scholar in any of this, but I'm sure that the details are relevant, and it's possible to explain, well, why why is this kind of this part of the cathedral kind of cordoned off in such a way so that you have to go through this to get there, and why are there these kinds of designs in the walls, and so on. Everything kind of has a meaning to it, and because it's meant to house certain kinds of human practices, to orient and to kind of, in a sense, direct people's attention in certain ways. And ultimately, I think we want to think about technology in that way as well. And then it's not an enemy anymore. It's the it's just the kind of increasingly global architecture that we're living with, and there's nothing predetermined about it. There's nothing in the technology, whether it's social media or other forms of media, whether it kind of data collection, or whether it's medical technology and the development of prostheses, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. There's no reason to see any of this as anti-human. It's not. It's done by humans, and it's done for humans, and there's no reason to assume that this implies transhumanism, or that we're going to leave our bodies, or that our bodies go into this as well, and our bodies have always been connected to to the rituals and to the environment that's surrounding us, and that will still be the case. And so I think that if we kind of change our way of thinking about technology, we there's nothing leftist about any of this technology. And in fact, quite to the contrary, I think it's more likely to make certain dominant trends in leftist, egalitarian, and so on thinking irrelevant and obsolete than it is to make more more kind of conservative, or more kind of authoritative, let's say, center seeking, center accepting approaches, because in a sense there is a center to all the technology. It's kind of presented in a certain sense on a technological level. You could say it's decentralized, and again, that's kind of privileged, and a lot of talk about crypto and stuff like that. There's this kind of valorization of decentralization, and again, decentralization is neither bad or good, but it's always decentralization in relation to some center, and I think that there is an emergent center, and it is kind of a global center. And what this means for nationalism and stuff like that is another question. I don't think it excludes any of that at all, because there are going to be all kinds of ways of mediating from the center. But I think there will be some kind of global ordering, even a nationalist society. Even if you take the way in which some nationalists would want to have, kind of cut off immigration and establish a single national language. Well, fine, you might be able to do all of that, but that wouldn't mean you're not part of a global order. That would just be your way of being related to a global order. There'd still be someone over the border that you'd be talking to, that you'd be engaging with in some ways, right? So these are all just ways of engaging with I'm speaking about it now a little bit kind of tongue in cheek, a little bit kind of ironically, as a kind of central intelligence that is emerging, just in terms of just so data can be exchanged, right? From so that someone doing medical research in Russia can benefit from someone doing medical research in Buenos Aires or anywhere else. I mean, that they have to be kind of they have to be commensurate with each other, the practices and the standards and the forms of experimentation and so on, and they will become more standardized. And in a lot of ways, it's good that they become more standardized, so that someone gathering data about the development of certain viruses on one side of the world can help think about treatments for that virus that may have to be modified because the genetic makeup and the environment of people on the other side of the world might be a bit different. But we want a kind of fluency across all of this, and I think all the stuff with COVID, all the conflicts. I think that these issues are more political than they are technological. There's nothing in developing medicines or developing vaccines or anything like that exclude allowing people at different levels to experiment with different things and try out one treatment rather than another. I mean, the whole idea that all vaccines would be mandated for everyone all down the line, and that your whole life gets destroyed if you don't take this vaccine. None of this is inherent in any of the technology. None of this is inherent in any of the science. And in fact, I would say exactly the opposite. And people are pointing this out all the time, that they have to deny all kinds of scientific discoveries, and they have to exclude all kinds of cures that don't fit their bureaucracies and so on. So I think, we actually have a lot to gain by taking a much more positive view of science and technology, and thinking about how much science and technology are not these kind of abstract and sort of disembodied kind of processes, but they're human to the core. I mean, there are people doing all of these things. There are people learning how to do all these things. There are people in labs who screw up and make mistakes and do all kinds of things, but also teach each other and discover things and so on. And I think if we kind of argued in favor of letting them do what they can do, then the results would be more along the lines of what we want than along the lines of what they want, to use kind of the obvious we they distinctions that were it's kind of in the background here. And I think that and I think that it will be possible to talk about whatever anyone wants to talk about: nationalism, Christianity, and so on. And I think, again, nothing in the technology excludes the possibility of seeing the Christian revelation as kind of creating a new sort of platform, if you like, of human existence that we're still working with, that we're still exploring, that hasn't been exhausted yet. You could make that case, and again, that doesn't put you at odds with any technology, with any science or anything else. And again, the same with nationalism, the same with with all the other stuff. And so that I think that as we go forward, and as people get more and more frustrated with I don't know. One thing that we're going to have to learn, I think, is and it's a very hard thing to learn, is to stop taking debate, because a lot of it's baiting, right? The latest kind of outrage. When you think about it, it's at least a part. Yeah, I mean, they really want to do these things, okay, but it's also they want to kind of draw you in. They want to get you angry. They want to get you to expose yourself. They want to gather data about you. They want to gather information about you and others like you, and it becomes a means of control. And so it's very hard when you see them doing something, obviously crazy, right, in schools or anywhere else. And of course, if you're on the ground and you can help to stop them from doing something crazy, well, by all means, yes, do that. But at the same time, you need to be able to kind of step back and say, well, if it's not directly my business, then what is my business? In a sense, maybe I can help build something that will ultimately help someone in that situation and eliminate those situations, instead of kind of living inside of these kind of media generated events. And when we do that, then, and again, I think a lot of people are starting to kind of get this and to move in the direction of, like, how does the media work, right? How is it kind of jerking us around, right? How is it kind of, how does it operate? How is it part of, various government agencies, and how does this all go together? And then you think about how you would start to, develop different ways of kind of organizing human beings in relation to technology, and I think we'll have, we'll have very productive discussions. And obviously, I think, the originary hypothesis, generative anthropology, I think will provide a kind of extremely powerful way of thinking consistently and kind of having conversations along these lines. So at any rate, that's kind of my mission, right? I'm sort of an evangelical in that regard. So.
Yeah, very well said. Anything I would say now would just be adding to what you've already said. I agree with you entirely. Yeah, and I suppose that's a good place to conclude as well. I also think, technology, money, whatever these things are, they're just tools. So long as we have a center to the civilization, it will be directed towards that. We'll be directed towards ends that suit us.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so the book, Anthropomorphics, and you've used a pen name, Dennis Bouvard, which I'm probably mispronouncing.
I'm not even sure how to pronounce it.
You're not sure did you pull it out of a hat? How did you choose?
No, well, yeah, it's a character in a novel of Flaubert's, Bouvard and Pécuchet.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, this it's a little bit of a joke. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
I mean,
well, it went over my head.
Okay, yeah, well, it's not very important. It's a novel. It's a satirical novel. It's a very, very funny novel, actually, and it's about two 19th century bachelors who from chapter to chapter, he never finished the novel, but it's pretty finished. From chapter to chapter, go from one kind of sort of ridiculous fad to another, right? And he's kind of satirizing the emergence in the 19th century of all these kind of new sort of disciplines, but also kind of fraud. Right. So one chapter there's this whole new method of gardening that they get into, and then they spend the whole time doing that. Then there's some new method of whatever exercising that they get into. So the characters are ridiculous, but I like I like taking the name from there because with Flaubert, I always think that he has a bit of love for these ridiculous characters who get caught up in some mimetic enthusiasm, mimetic contagion, and that he loves that nevertheless, even if they're ridiculous, even if they're stupid, that just this willingness to just devote yourself completely to a particular way of thinking and just to exhaust it, wherever it leads you. So I'm fine identifying myself with that. So that's why I took that name for the book. But it's always been a pretty thin disguise. I haven't really been undercover or something like that.
No. Well, it speaks to the kind of hyper novelty of our times.
Yeah, as well. Yeah, it's a very timely novel. Yeah.
Yeah, but your ideas will stand the test of time, I'm sure. And thank you for the book. Thank you for your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for listening. Bye for now.